The high vaulted ceiling of the Grand Conclave of Autheria was not made of stone or steel, but of a resonating bioglass that hummed with the collective anxiety of 1,000 worlds, a sound like the dying breath of a nebula trapped in a bottle, vibrating through the spinal ridges of every delegate present. The air was thick, cloying with the scent of ozone and the pheromones of species pushed to the brink of extinction, a cocktail of biological terror that no atmospheric scrubber could fully purge. High Counselor Vaxen sat upon his dais, his 4 heavy hands resting motionless on the polished obsidian table, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of impending doom that seemed to synchronize with the flashing red strobes of the holographic galaxy map floating in the center of the chamber. The map was a slaughter, a visual representation of a galaxy bleeding out, where the encroaching darkness of the Scourge, a parasitic, void-born civilization that did not conquer but consumed, had turned whole sectors into silent graveyards. The Scourge did not negotiate. They did not pause for rest. They were a biological imperative written in the language of entropy, and they were winning. Vaxen looked out over the assembly, seeing the faces of the coalition representatives, species that had stood proud and arrogant only a standard cycle ago, now reduced to bickering children huddled in the dark. There were the Krill, whose carapace armor, once thought impenetrable, had been cracked open like brittle pottery by the Scourge's plasma lances, the ethereal scions of the nebula drift, whose psychic screams had been silenced by the sheer, mindless noise of the enemy horde, and the warrior caste Dorani, who had spent millennia perfecting the art of honorable combat only to find that the Scourge possessed no honor, only an insatiable hunger. They had all failed. The grand fleets of the coalition, the pride of 100 civilizations, were now drifting debris fields, expanding rings of metal and frozen biological matter slowly rotating in the cold dark. It was this desperation, this absolute and crushing realization of their own inadequacy, that had forced Vaxen's hand, compelling him to send the signal into the unknown regions of the galactic spiral arm, into the dead zones where the radiation was high and the stars were old and unstable. He had sent the signal to the species that the coalition had shunned for centuries, the species that was considered too volatile, too industrial, too dangerously creative to be allowed into the polite society of the stars. He had called for humanity. "They are late," muttered Thaler, the Dorani representative, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm of agitation that grated on Vaxen's nerves. Thaler stood by the edge of the holographic pit, watching the red tide of the Scourge advance toward the Autherian home system. "We debased ourselves, Vaxen. We sent a plea into the dark, begging the primitives to save us, and they have not even the courtesy to respond with a confirmation. Perhaps they are dead. Perhaps the Scourge found them in their isolation and extinguished them before they could even launch a ship. We placed our hopes on ghosts." Vaxen shifted his weight, his large, dark eyes fixing Thaler with a look of weary patience. "They are not ghosts, Thaler. The transmission was received. The telemetry confirmed a handshake protocol. They are coming. But you must understand, we did not ask for a skirmish fleet. We asked for salvation. We used the phrase total war. In the linguistics of the Terrans, that phrase carries a weight we do not fully comprehend. It takes time to move the weight of a world." "Time is the one resource we have exhausted," Thaler snapped, gesturing to the map where a new cluster of warnings blossomed like bruised fruit. "The Scourge Vanguard has breached the outer markers of the Autheria system. Their bioships are feeding on the gas giants, refueling for the final burn toward the core worlds. If the humans do not arrive within the next rotation, there will be no one left to save. We should be evacuating the council, not waiting for a myth." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, a sound of defeat that Vaxen found more terrifying than the enemy fleet. If the leadership broke, the panic would filter down to the billions of civilians on the surface below, and the chaos would do the Scourge's work for them. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer one last platitude about hope and endurance, but the words died in his throat as the resonance of the ceiling changed pitch. It was not a sound at first, but a pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air that made the fluid in Vaxen's inner ears tilt. The ambient light in the chamber, generated by the bioluminescent moss that lined the pillars, flickered and dimmed, as if the energy of the room was being siphoned away by a massive gravitational presence. The holographic map sputtered, the red tide of the Scourge momentarily vanishing, replaced by a wall of static that roared with the intensity of a solar flare. Then the sensors shrieked. Every alarm in the Grand Conclave, from the seismic monitors in the planetary crust to the orbital defense grid arrays, triggered simultaneously, a cacophony of warnings that merged into a single deafening tone of absolute overload. Thaler stumbled back, clutching his head, his mandibles flared in shock. What is that? The scourge. Have they bypassed the grid? Is it a weapon? No, Vaxon whispered, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with awe. Look at the data. It is not an attack. It is an displacement. He pointed a trembling finger at the main view screen, which had overridden the map to show the live feed from the orbital satellites. The view was of the void beyond Autheria's moon, a patch of space that should have been empty starfields. Instead, the fabric of spacetime was tearing. It was not the clean, surgical opening of a warp gate, the elegant blue swirl of coalition drive technology. This was a brutal, violent rupture, a shattering of reality that looked as if a god had taken a hammer to the glass of the universe. Reality bled. Colors that the Autherian eyes were not evolved to see spilled out of the wound in the cosmos, violet and burning gold, followed by a silence that seemed to suck the sound out of the vacuum itself. And then they emerged. They did not come as a fleet of distinct ships. They came as a wall. The first vessel to breach the tier was so large that the sensors failed to calculate its mass, returning error codes that suggested it was a rogue planetoid. It was a slab of gray, scarred metal, ugly and utilitarian, devoid of the sleek curves and aesthetic grace of coalition design. It was a brick thrown through a window, a monument to brutalist efficiency. And it was not alone. Behind it, tethered by beams of magnetic energy that crackled like lightning, came another, and another, and another, until the view screen was filled with a horizon of steel. These were not ships designed for patrols or diplomatic escorts. These were moving cities, mobile foundries, weaponized asteroids hollowed out, and filled with engines that burned with the fury of trapped stars. They blocked out the light of the local sun, casting a literal shadow over the Autherian capital, a twilight brought on by the sheer density of human engineering. The silence in the conclave was absolute. Even Thaler was struck dumb, his warrior instincts failing to categorize what he was seeing. This was not a military force. It was a migration of industrial might. The lead vessel, a behemoth that bristled with antenna arrays and kinetic cannon batteries the size of skyscrapers, hailed the surface. The transmission did not ask for permission to dock. It did not request a frequency for diplomatic niceties. Simply overrode the planetary communications grid, booming from every speaker, every personal device, every public address system on the planet. The voice was calm, synthetic yet undeniably human, stripped of emotion but heavy with authority. This is High Admiral Vance of the Terran Union Expeditionary Force. We received your distress call. We acknowledge the condition of total war. Planetary control is now assumed by Terran Logistics Command. Do not resist. We are here to work. Vaxon felt his knees give way and he sank back into his seat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Assumed control? A representative from the Sion delegation whispered, their voice trembling. They are taking over. We asked for help, not occupation. Vaxon looked at the Sion, his eyes wide. You do not understand, he rasped. To them, there is no difference. If you want them to save you, you must let them become you. We opened the door to the giants. Now we must survive their footsteps. The screen shifted again, zooming in on the flanks of the massive human vessels. They were deploying smaller craft, but these were not fighters. They were construction drones, atmosphere processors, and orbital tethers. Thousands of them, swarming like metal locusts, descending toward the planet and the surrounding moons. High Counselor, the communications officer called out, his voice cracking. The human admiral is demanding a physical interface. He is translocating directly to the conclave chamber. He says he does not have time for the elevator. Before Vaxon could process the absurdity of the statement, the air in the center of the room twisted. There was a crack of displaced air, a smell of ozone and stale recycled oxygen, and a beam of hard light slammed into the floor. When the light faded, a figure stood there. He was not wearing the powered armor of a shock trooper or the ceremonial robes of a diplomat. He wore a simple, pressed uniform of charcoal gray, unadorned save for a single row of ribbons on his chest and a badge that read Terra. He was old. His face was a map of deep lines and silver scars, his skin pale from a lifetime spent under artificial UV lights. He looked tired, with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of worlds, yet his posture was straight, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory intelligence. Admiral Vance did not bow. He did not offer a greeting in the Autherian tongue. He walked to the center of the obsidian table, ignoring the flinching delegates, and placed a heavy, ruggedized data slate on the surface. Sit, Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying to the back of the hall. We have approximately 4 standard hours before the main body of the hostile force engages your outer sphere. In that time, we need to restructure your entire planetary defense grid, evacuate your northern hemisphere, and retune your atmospheric shields to a frequency that won't boil your oceans when we open fire. I suggest you stop looking at me like I'm a monster and start looking at the data. Thaler slammed his fist onto the table, his pride finally overriding his shock. You presume much human. You arrive here, block our sun, and dictate terms to the High Council. We are the Authari. We founded this coalition while your ancestors were banging rocks together. We asked for military aid, not a hostile takeover of our infrastructure. Where are your warriors? Where are the fleets of interception? All I see are flying factories and tired old men. The silence that followed was heavy. Vance stopped manipulating the holographic display on his slate and slowly looked up at Thaler. The look in the human's eyes was not anger. It was pity. It was the look a parent gives a child who does not understand that the house is burning down. You asked for total war, Vance said softly. I don't think you know what that means. You think war is fleets meeting in the dark, exchanging plasma fire until one side retreats. That is a skirmish. That is a duel. Vance tapped the table and the hologram changed. It showed the Terran fleet in orbit. It showed the massive vessels uncoupling, revealing that they were not just ships, but mobile gates, fabricators, and shield generators. Total war is not about fighting. It is about logistics. It is about economics. It is about the absolute and total mobilization of every gram of matter and every joule of energy toward a single purpose, the cessation of the enemy's existence. You asked where my warriors are. Vance gestured to the screen, where thousands of automated drones were already welding reinforcement beams to the Autharian orbital elevators. My warriors are the engineers who are currently reinforcing your crust so your planet doesn't crack when we fire the main batteries. My warriors are the doctors converting your sports stadiums into triage centers. My warriors are the physicists rewriting the laws of thermodynamics in your upper atmosphere to create a heat sink for the enemy weapons. Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. You fight to win battles, counselor. We fight to end the concept of the conflict, the enemy you call the scourge, the Xylos as we catalog them. They operate on a swarm logic. They rely on overwhelming numbers and biological recycling. You cannot shoot them enough to win. You run out of ammo before they run out of bodies, so we didn't bring more guns. We brought a system that turns their own biomass against them. We brought total war. Now are you going to let us work, or are you going to die with your pride intact? Vaxon watched the exchange, seeing the raw, terrifying pragmatism of the human. It was a coldness that chilled him, yet within that coldness was a core of burning heat, a ferocious desire to preserve life hidden behind a mask of indifference. Let them work, Vaxon said, his voice trembling but firm. Thaler, sit down. The coalition is dead. The Authari are dead. We are now. Assets. Let the Terran command proceed. Thaler looked at Vaxon with betrayal in his eyes, but he sank back into his seat, defeated. Vance nodded once, a curt, efficient motion. Good decision. Communications, initiate protocol ironclad. Begin the terraforming of the outer moons. We need gun emplacements, and we need them 5 minutes ago. The hours that followed were a blur of sensory overload for the Autharian Council. They watched, helpless, as the humans dismantled their society and rebuilt it in real time. The massive Terran ships, which Vance called world forges, descended into the lower orbit. They deployed tethers that latched onto the uninhabited moons of the gas giants, literally towing them into new orbits to create physical shields against the incoming fire. It was celestial mechanics weaponized. On the surface, dropships slammed down into the major cities, disgorging legions of construction mechs and synth soldiers. Faceless, robotic infantry that moved with liquid coordination, setting up shield generators, reinforcing bunk. RS and distributing rations that were flavorless but chemically perfect for Autharian physiology. The humans did not speak to the civilians. They simply moved them, protected them, and built walls around them. It was efficient, impersonal, and terrifyingly effective. Then the Scourge arrived. They came not out of hyperspace, but from the darkness between the stars, a biological sludge that blocked out the constellations. The Scourge fleet was a living thing, millions of bioships made of flesh and bone and hate, pulsing with a sickly green light. They shrieked across the electromagnetic spectrum, a psychic howl that drove telepaths insane and made the Autharian sensors bleed static. Vaxon watched the main screen, his heart stopping. The sheer scale of the enemy was incomprehensible. It was a wave of death that spanned light seconds. They are here, he whispered. There are too many. Even with your world forges, Admiral, there are too many. Vance stood at the center of the command hub he had established in the council chamber, his eyes fixed on the data streams cascading around him. He did not look at the enemy fleet. He looked at the energy output readings of his own ships. Numbers are irrelevant, Vance muttered. Geometry is relevant, energy density is relevant, vector control is relevant. He tapped his headset. All units hold fire, let them enter the kill box. Wait for the density to reach critical mass. Hold fire, Thaler screamed, jumping up. They are firing on the orbital habitats. They are melting the outer defense rings. You must return fire. Not yet, Vance said, his voice like a granite slab. If we fire now, we scatter them. We need them condensed. We need them confident. The scourge poured into the system, sensing the lack of resistance. They swarmed over the Autharian moons, their acid spitters dissolving the ancient rock, their landing tendrils burrowing into the crust. They ignored the silent, hulking shapes of the Terran world forges, mistaking them for derelict debris or harmless infrastructure. They drove straight for the planet, a spear of green fire aimed at the heart of Autheria. The tension in the chamber was physical. Delegates were weeping, praying to gods that had long since abandoned them. The sky above the capital turned green with the exhaust of the approaching horde. Now, Vance said. He didn't shout, he didn't press a big red button. He simply gave a permission code. The reaction was instantaneous. The debris of the Terran fleet, the massive, ugly slabs of metal, woke up. They didn't just fire cannons, they unleashed physics. The world forges activated gravity well generators, massive engines that created localized singularities. The lead elements of the Scourge fleet were not blown up, they were crushed. Space-time crumpled around them, twisting their biological hulls into impossible shapes, snapping spines and shattering carapaces. In the same second, the tethers connected to the towed moons pulsed with energy, turning the moons themselves into massive kinetic railgun rounds, swinging them through the enemy formation with the force of a colliding planet. It was not a battle. It was an industrial accident weaponized on a galactic scale. The Scourge, which relied on swarming and overwhelming, found themselves trapped in a grinder. The Terran targeting computers, cold and unfeeling, picked apart the enemy coordination. Kinetic rounds the size of buildings slammed into the Scourge motherships, shattering them into dust. And then came the drones. Millions of them, released from the bellies of the world forges. They didn't shoot, they boarded. They drilled into the bioships, releasing nanites that ate the organic matter, converting the enemy fleet into raw resources. Resource acquisition at 400%, a cool female voice announced from the console. Fabricators are spinning up. We are printing ammunition from the enemy hulls. Vaxon stared, his mouth agape. You are eating them. Vance turned, his face illuminated by the holographic destruction. I told you, total war. We don't waste matter. The enemy brought the mass we needed to defeat them. It was very generous of them. But the Scourge was ancient, and it did not die easily. The central hive mind of the enemy adapted. The rear guard of the biological fleet coalesced, merging together to form a monstrosity of flesh and plasma, a Titan-class bioform that dwarfed even the Terran world forges. It unleashed a beam of psionic energy that bypassed the shields, slamming into one of the Terran ships. The human vessel buckled, its hull groaning, atmosphere venting into the void. Thousands of human lives were extinguished in a second. For the first time, Vance's expression changed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The cold calculator vanished, replaced for a microsecond by a grieving father before the mask slammed back into place. Damage report, he barked. The UNS Hammer is lost, Admiral. Core breach. All hands lost. Vance closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Vent the drive core, turn the Hammer into a bomb, ram it. The council gasped. There might be survivors, a delegate cried. There are no survivors in a core breach, Vance said, his voice flat, devoid of the mercy he clearly wished he could afford. There is only the mission, execute. On the screen, the dying human ship, burning and broken, fired its maneuvering thrusters one last time. It accelerated toward the Scourge Titan, a suicide run of defiance. The collision was silent in the void, but the flash of light blinded the sensors. The drive core detonated, a miniature supernova that incinerated the biological monstrosity, vaporizing the heart of the Scourge invasion. The shockwave cleared the upper atmosphere, stripping the clouds away, leaving the sky naked and burning. Silence returned to the chamber. The red dots on the map were gone. The green tide had been turned to ash. The Terran fleet hovered amidst the wreckage, scarred but unbroken, their fabrication bays already churning out repair drones to fix the Autharian orbital rings. Vaxon looked at Vance. The human was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He was trembling, not with fear, but with the adrenaline crash of a man who had just spent lives like currency. "It is over," Vaxon whispered, the relief making him lightheaded. "You saved us. The scourge is destroyed." Vance slowly straightened up, wiping a smear of blood from his nose where the pressure change had ruptured a vessel. He looked at Vaxon, and the look in his eyes was haunting. It was not the look of a victor. It was the look of a man who knew the night was far from over. "No," Vance said, his voice heavy with a terrible truth. "The scourge was not the enemy. The scourge was running." The statement hung in the air, sucking the joy out of the room. "Running?" Thaler asked. "Running from what?" Vance tapped the console, and the view screen changed. It showed the trajectory of the Scourge fleet before it entered the system. It showed the vectors they had been traveling on for thousands of years. They were not expanding, they were fleeing. They were a refugee population, driven mad by hunger and fear, pushing into the galaxy to escape something behind them, something in the intergalactic void. "We call it the Great Filter," Vance said, his voice taking on a philosophical weight. "Or the Silence. We found it 300 years ago. That is why humanity became this. That is why we stopped building art museums and started building world forges. That is why we embraced total war, not to conquer you, but to build a wall." Vance zoomed the map out past the galaxy into the deep dark. There were no stars there, only a creeping absence, a shadow that was blocking out the light of distant galaxies. "The Scourge was just the first wave of debris," Vance continued. "What comes next is not biological, it is entropic, it is a negation of life, and it is coming here." He turned to the council, his eyes hard and clear. "We did not come here just to save Autheria. We came here to conscript you. We need your resources, we need your minds, we need your fleets. The war is not over, the war has just begun." Vaxon looked at the human, then at the map, then at the terrified faces of his peers. He realized then that the universe was far larger and far crueler than he had ever imagined. The humans were not the knights in shining armor. They were the grave diggers who had decided to fight death itself with shovels and determination. They were monsters of necessity. What do we do?" Vaxon asked, his voice small. Vance picked up his slate and turned toward the transporter beam. "We build," he said. "We fortify, we prepare, and when the dark comes, we light a fire so big it burns the shadows away. Welcome to the Terran Union, Counselor. Get your people to the factories. We have work to do." As Vance vanished in the beam of light, Vaxon looked out the window at the sky. The Terran ships were already moving, harvesting the wreckage of the Scourge, turning death into steel. It was ugly, it was brutal, it was total war. And for the first time in his life, Vaxon felt a strange, cold comfort. They were no longer alone in the dark. They had monsters of their own now, and the monsters were on their side. The Grand Conclave was silent for a long time after the human departed. The hum of the bioglass ceiling had returned, but it was different now, steady, rhythmic, synchronized with the pounding of the industrial engines in orbit. Vaxon looked at his hands, the hands of a diplomat, soft and uncalloused. He realized they would not remain that way. The era of diplomacy was dead. The era of the engineer had begun. He turned to Thaler. "Draft the orders," he said, his voice finding a new strength. "Mobilize the population, every citizen, every child, every elder. If the humans want total war, we will give them total war." Thaler nodded, a new phone. Respect in his eyes. "For Autheria," he said. "No," Vaxon corrected, looking up at the brutalist shapes blotting out the stars. "For existence." The story of the Authari and the humans was not one of friendship. It was not a story of cultural exchange or happy endings. It was a story of survival. It was a story of two species standing back to back against the heat death of the universe, screaming defiance into the void, armed with nothing but mathematics, steel, and the indomitable will to refuse the dying of the light. And in that refusal, in that shared burden of total war, they found a unity stronger than any peace treaty. They found the brotherhood of the trench, and together they waited for the dark. The construction drones buzzed in the upper atmosphere, a swarm of mechanical bees weaving a hive of tungsten and energy. Below them, the cities of Autheria began to change. Gardens were paved over for landing pads. Temples were converted into server farms. The aesthetic beauty of the world was stripped away, layer by layer, revealing the raw, muscular geometry of survival beneath. It was a desecration, perhaps, to the artists and the poets. But to the soldiers, to the engineers, to the ones who looked at the sky and saw the approaching storm, it was the most beautiful thing in the universe. It was the shape of hope. And hope, as the humans had taught them, was not a feeling. Hope was a fortified position with overlapping fields of fire. Vaxon stood at the window, watching the transformation. He felt a vibration in the floor, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to come from the core of the planet itself. The humans were installing a planetary drive. They were going to move Autheria. The sheer audacity of it made him dizzy. To move a world, to turn a home into a ship. It was madness, it was brilliance, it was human. He placed his hand on the glass, feeling the cold vibration. "Let them come," he whispered to the approaching silence. "Let the darkness come, we are ready." The lights of the fleet above blinked in a sequence that Vaxon now recognized. It was not a code of war, nor a code of peace. It was a heartbeat, a synchronized pulse of 1 billion souls, alien and human, beating against the silence. Thump, 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 the rhythm of total war, the rhythm of life. Deep in the void, beyond the sensors, beyond the light of the furthest stars, the silence watched. It had consumed 1,000 galaxies. It had extinguished 1 trillion lives. It was entropy incarnate. But as it gazed upon the tiny, defiant spark of the Autherian system, it felt something it had never felt before. It felt resistance. It felt a wall. And for the first time in eons, the silence paused. The humans had arrived, and they had brought the noise. The final phase of the integration began 3 cycles later. Admiral Vance returned, not to the council chamber, but to the orbital shipyards that now encircled the planet like a ring of iron. He stood on the observation deck of the UNS Dauntless, looking down at the swirling clouds of Autheria. Next to him stood Vaxon, clad now in a utilitarian jumpsuit similar to the human uniform, his ceremonial robes discarded. The alien counselor looked out at his world, barely recognizing it. The continents were laced with maglev tracks, the oceans were dotted with fusion extractors. It was a fortress world. "It hurts to look at it, doesn't it?" Vance asked, his voice low. "Yes," Vaxon admitted. "It was a garden once, a place of peace." "Peace is a luxury," Vance said, his eyes distant. "Gardens are for those who have killed the wolves. We haven't killed the wolves yet, Vaxon. We are still building the fence." Vance gestured to the starfield. "The signal we intercepted from the entity chasing the scourge. We deciphered the last packet this morning." Vaxon stiffened, and... "It wasn't a threat," Vance said. "It was a countdown." The human admiral turned to the alien, his expression grim. "We have 10 years. 10 years before the great filter arrives at this sector. In 10 years, we have to turn this entire spiral arm into a weapon. Not just your world. All of them. The Krill, the Sions, the Dorani. We have to unite them. By diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary." Vaxon looked at Vance, seeing the immense burden the human carried. He realized then that the total war was not against the aliens or even the scourge. It was a war against time. It was a war against the inevitable. "They will not understand," Vaxon said. "The Council, the other species, they will see you as conquerors." "I know," Vance said softly. "That is why we need you. We can build the guns, Vaxon. We can build the shields, but we cannot build trust. You have to be the bridge. You have to tell them that the monsters are coming and that the only thing standing between them and the dark is the Terran Union." Vaxon nodded slowly. He understood now. The humans were the shield bearers, but they needed a voice. They were T. He muscled, but they needed a soul. "I will do it," Vaxon said. "I will bring them to the table, or I will bring them to the anvil." Vance offered a rare, small smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. "Good, then let's get to work. The shift starts now." The 2 leaders turned back to the tactical display where the galaxy spun in slow motion. Red zones, blue zones, disputed territories. It was a mess, it was chaos. But in the center, a new color was spreading. A steel-gray contagion of order, the color of Terra, the color of Autheria, the color of the Alliance. As the Dauntless broke orbit, leading the new joint fleet toward the Krill border, Vaxon felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was pride, fierce, burning pride. They had been weak. They had been dying. Now they were part of the machine. They were the gears of war, and they would grind the silence into dust. The stars watched them pass, indifferent and cold, but the fleet did not care for the stars' approval. They carried their own light, and in the darkness of the void, that was all that mattered. The signal went out, encoded on the sub-ether bands, a message to every sentient species in the quadrant. It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of existence. "This is the Terran-Autherian Alliance. We are here. We are armed. We are awake. Join us or step aside. The great work has begun." And deep in the dark, the silence heard, and for the first time it knew fear, because humanity did not just bring war. Humanity brought the one thing entropy could not consume. Humanity brought meaning. and against that the dark had no defense. The fleet jumped, a streak of fire across the night, leaving a scar of light that would not fade for 1,000 years. The story of the Athari was over. The story of the Alliance had begun, and it would be written in fire, in steel, and in the unyielding defiance of the total war. The end of the beginning,